All right, so everybody that's listening to us, if it's on the podcasting sites, like, subscribe, share. We have a very, very special guest, one of my favorites coming on here. If you're listening to us on one of the radio stations, we greatly appreciate you listening. This is Professor Richard Wolff. He's been on the program multiple times, and we're always grateful to have him on. You can find more about Professor Wolff at rdwolff.com or democracyatwork.info. He does have a YouTube show. It's Economic Update on YouTube. You can check him out there. And also the book that he put out in 2020, The Sickness is the System, When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself. That was a lot, Professor Wolff, for me to read, but we made it through. You've done so much stuff, it's hard, but we got through it. So Professor Wolff, thanks so much for always coming on. Greatly appreciate you.
My pleasure, Rob. Glad to be here.
So again, you are the man to talk about the craziness going on in our country and our world. So I'm going to just lay it out there for you to do this. We've seen 3 banks go down in the past year. Commercial real estate is in a crisis, along with the credit and student loan crises in the country. What's about to happen? Tell the listeners.
All right. I'm going to tell you not so much what's about to happen. I don't much believe in predicting the future. If you want to do that, go to a nearby carnival, find the lady, give her $1, and she'll tell you all about what's going to happen to you. It's a nice amusement, but I can't tell the future any better than anybody else can. What I can do is tell you where we are, economically speaking. But before I do, I just want you all to know, like they say in certain kinds of movies, you may not like what you're about to see or hear. So if you don't want to learn about what's actually going on, then don't listen to me. Just turn on the radio and television, and they'll give you a nice, comforting make-believe as a substitute. All right, here we go. This is about the United States at a historic turning point in its history. We were born as a nation, the United States, as a small corner of the British Empire. They had come over here from Europe. They had basically destroyed the local population they found here, as we all know, and they had settled Europeans here as a colonial outpost. Then at the end of the 18th century, the United States decided it didn't want to be a colony anymore of the British Empire, and we had a war because the British Empire was not willing to give up its domination of this part of the world. And we had the War of Independence. We celebrate that in a few weeks on the 4th of July, as we do each year. The British lost that war. We became an independent country. The British didn't like it, so they went to war again against us in 1812, and the United States defeated the British again. And the British never tried to do that again. They were defeated twice. The rest of the 19th century, the British Empire was still dominant. The United States was slowly but steadily gaining. And eventually, World War I is usually when this is dated, the roles reversed. The upcoming United States became the global power, and the British shrank to be what they always had been before, a small, cold, wet island offshore the mainland of Europe, which is what they are now. The 20th century was the heyday of the American Empire. We replaced the British, just like before the British had replaced the Dutch, who had replaced the Persians, who had replaced the Romans and the Greeks, and on and on and on. The history of the world is the rise and fall of empires. It has always been the case that when the empire was on the upswing, conditions were pretty good for most of the people involved. But when the economy turned down, when the empire was over, the ride down was a lot less fun than the rise up. The 20th century was the rise up for the United States. But we peaked, and here comes the explanation for why we have. the banking crisis and the student loan crisis and the fill in the blank crisis. About 30 years ago, more or less, the world changed. The American empire peaked and began its slow descent.
Professor
A
Wolff, just
new
a quick
empire.
interruption. Are you going back to the Reagan years? Is this where we're talking?
No, a little bit later. It's really more the
Okay.
Clinton years.
Okay.
It doesn't matter exactly which year. It's history.
Right.
It's a little fuzzy that way.
Okay.
But suddenly, the world saw a new economic power arising in the world. Just like the British watched their little colony in North America become the colossus of the United States, we are now watching another group of nations take our place. Here's who they are. The United States has a group of allies that work with them. Nowadays, they are called the G7. That's the United States, Western Europe, Canada, and Japan. They used to be the dominant force of the global economy for most of the 20th century and certainly the second half of the 20th century. But there is now a competitor powerhouse in the economy. And for lack of a better term, they are called the BRICS, B-R-I-C-S. And that stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. In the year 2020, the BRICS caught up with the G7. That is the GDP, the gross domestic product, and that's simply a measure of the total output of goods and services achieved in one calendar year. In 2020, the G7, the United States and its allies on the one hand, and the BRICS, China and its allies on the other, had equal GDPs. 3 years later, now as I speak with you, the GDP of the BRICS rose and the GDP of the G7 fell. The GDP of the BRICS is now about 1/3, 33% of the total output of this planet in terms of goods and services, whereas the G7 accounts for about 29%. In other words, the BRICS are now a bigger economic unit than the United States and its allies are. And that changes everything. Every small country in the world, in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, when they have a problem, where do they go for a loan? Where do they go to expand trade? Where do they go to get technical advice? They used to have to go to the United States and its allies. Now they have a choice because they can go to China and its allies. And what do they have? A bigger economic unit, a wealthier bloc of nations. And let's remember, India and China are the two biggest countries in the world by population. Russia is the biggest country in the world by geography. So you're talking about a powerhouse that has now surpassed the United States and its allies in terms of its output. Unless you are blind, deaf, and dumb, you know which way the economic wind is blowing. But here in the United States, and this is the problem, we have a society that doesn't want to see it, doesn't want to hear it, doesn't want to admit it, and doesn't want to take into account what's going on. That's why our politicians keep saying to us, well, we here in America, we are the best country, we're the richest country. It's not true. It was true. But over the last 30 years, it has changed and it isn't true anymore. You're not best off in this country. You're not even close anymore. And the gap between what's happening here and what is happening in other parts of the world is getting wider and wider. Sooner or later, whether it's Mr. Biden, Mr. Trump, or anybody else, telling the American people fairy stories, make believe, pretend is not going to cut it anymore. For most Americans, they still want to live in that world. I understand that. That's a human feeling. You don't want to face it when things have changed. But here's what the danger is. The people at the top, the 1%, the 5%, the rich people, the corporate leaders and all that, they are making sure to use their wealth and power so that as the United States goes down, they hold on to their wealth and their power. But if that's true, as it is, it means that the rest of us, the vast majority of us, we are the ones bearing the costs of decline. And that's why they're going to cut Social Security. And that's why we have an inflation where the prices rise faster than our ability to raise the wages we need to pay for it. That's why they're not going to help the graduate students who have money up that they borrowed to go to college to get degrees. That's why we're not solving our housing problem, our homeless problem. We are in a situation where we are making believe, and so we don't face the actuality of what happened. Let me give you one more illustration. The war in Vietnam. The United States lost that war. The war in Afghanistan, we lost it. The war in Iraq, we lost it. The war going on in Ukraine, we're going to lose it. And you can keep making believe and you can keep telling yourself other stories, but those are the realities. And when you tell phony stories against a changing reality, sooner or later, the reality wins that one. You can't keep up make-believe. And yet we live in a society where our Republican and Democratic leaders compete with each other about make-believe. It's extraordinary.
I was talking to a friend that works on Wall Street. He was talking about that this crisis is going to be worse than 2008. It's going to be like a 2021 economy. I know we're not Nostradamus here, but we talk about the anti-regulations of, Reagan all the ways down to Biden. And not just that, or everything you spoke about. Are you worried about this happening? I know we're not trying to play Nostradamus here, but It seems like if we're being honest with each other, it's not being Nostradamus, it's being truthful to the American people. And are you seeing bank runs in the future with the dollar failing? Because it seems like it's about to fail.
Look, I mean, again, I'm an economist. I spend my time studying this. As little as 25 years ago, if you traveled around the world, country by country, and you went to visit the central bank of each country, we have a central bank here. It has a funny name, Federal Reserve. In most countries, it's called like the Bank of England or the Bank of France or the Bank of Italy and so on. If you visited 25 years ago these banks, and you would have asked, what is the security that you hold in reserve so that anybody who has your currency, your Italian euro or your British pound or whatever it is, that you have something to back that up? And they would say, yes, we have a reserve of gold and the dollar, because the dollar is as good as gold. The dollar comprised in the neighborhood of 75, 80% of bank reserves around the world. Today, that number is under 50%. They don't hold the dollar anymore. Why? Because the United States isn't the powerhouse anymore. They are holding euros. They are holding increasingly Chinese yuan. They are looking at new ways of doing trade. Saudi Arabia used to say, if you want to buy our oil, you pay in dollars. They no longer require that. They are cutting deals with other countries to use other currencies. These are all signs, if you're not blind, deaf, and dumb, that there is a change going on. And yes, that is going to hurt the United States. Other countries don't want to give the subsidy to the United States that is involved if you use the United States currency. They want that subsidy for themselves, which makes perfect sense. It's like the United States revolted against the British Empire because it wanted the benefits of trade and industry for itself and not for King George III sitting thousands of miles away in Britain. And you're not going to stop this. You're not going to stop the idea that the Chinese should change, like Mr. President Biden keeps saying, we need the Chinese to change their government. Why in the world would the Chinese listen? Which, of course, they don't. Over the last 30 years, the Chinese economy, GDP of China, has grown between 4 and 9%. That's 3 times the rate of the United States. The vast majority of the world has a number one priority: to get out of poverty and to stop being the backward, underdeveloped parts of the world. The fastest way to grow, you know what the model for that is now? China, not the United States. You're not going to make that go away by blathering and by talking. It's just going to make you more and more frustrated. And as Americans feel the declining economy, what the leaders of this country are doing, and it is extremely dangerous, is trying to distract the American people into dead-end scapegoating. Find somebody to blame. Find somebody to hate, because you're not willing to tell the people what's actually going on. So Americans decide immigrants are our danger. What a crock. What a nonsense. The maximum amount of undocumented immigrants we might have had in this country at any time over the last 20 years is maybe, I'm taking the outside estimate, 10 million. We are a country of 325 million people. 10 million undocumented immigrants don't make a difference. It's silly. It's childish. Blaming these desperately poor people coming into the country as if they're the cause of our problem and building a wall is a solution is such level of nonsense that it's not interesting to discuss. The only interesting question, why would people be so upset, so hysterical, that they would blame immigrants or maybe non-white people or maybe trans people? I mean, this is craziness because people are suffering, which is genuine. They're upset by it, which they have every right to be. They want to understand it, more power to them. But what they're fed by our government is hate the Russians, hate the Chinese, hate the immigrants, hate the trans. I mean, stop. This is crazy behavior, and it is dangerous because it might lead you then to pretend to yourself that you can do things you can't. And the best illustration is this war in Ukraine. Let me remind everyone, when the war started in February of last year, we were told by Mr. Biden and by the leaders of both parties, this won't take very long. We're going to crush the Russians. We're not going to buy the oil and gas they depend on. The ruble is going to collapse, and this will be taken care of quickly. Bullshit is the only. That was crazy.
We heard the same thing with Iraq. We heard the same thing going into Iraq.
Right. Same thing in Afghanistan. We were going to go in and wipe out the Taliban. You know who runs Afghanistan now? The Taliban. You know who came and left? The United States. I mean, you can keep making up stories. You can tell yourself fantasies. But as each of these events unfolds, it's going to get harder and harder. And you know, my biggest fear is that Americans, in their desperation, in their hysteria, not understanding what is going on, are going to make a mistake, and we live in an era of nuclear war, and then it's all over for all of us. And that would be the worst possible outcome. Look, after the War of 1812, the British figured out they can't defeat the United States militarily. The United States has to understand it cannot defeat Russia and China militarily. That's the end of the human race. All right? So you have to come to an accommodation. The Americans and the British did it. That's why we never fought with them again after 1812. That's 200 years we've managed. Let's sit down with the Russians and Chinese and the BRICS and work out a way to make the world less unequal, give them their chance to grow and prosper. Let us do it in an accommodation. That's our best chance forward.
I want to talk about this because a lot of people, as far as economists, people in the news, well, they're not going to bring it up regardless. I'm bringing up this issue, and I think this is ground zero for the problem for the U.S. is Africa. We look at that continent, and, you know, there's a lot of poverty there, but this is a continent which is the youngest continent in the world. Right. And they're going to be building the chips. That's where China went in. China's building these roads, these universities to educate all these Nigerians and every other country over there. South Africa, we could go, the list goes on. And the U.S. is behind the eight ball. They're just starting to come in now, which China has really established ties in that region of the world. So how bad is that if we really lose out on a whole continent of many different countries to establish allies with China? Or, you know, they pretty much have it locked, loaded, and sealed right now.
Well, I think that, look, we've had 200 years of capitalism and imperialism and colonialism. That's why Africa is as poor as it is. They have a long way to go to catch up. The Chinese are in there, you're right. The Chinese are working with them. But they have big needs. If the United States were genuinely willing to work out with China and Russia and those other countries a plan to help the rest of the world, so we are not rich over here and poor over there, that we're more of a global middle, there's plenty of room for the United States and China if they work together. But they're
not going to do that because of the military-industrial complex and the corporate capture of this country.
Right. And so the answer is there has to be a change in this country to put the demands of the people, which is for peace and an opportunity to grow, ahead of the profiteering by those who have captured this system. Look, and you know, we now have not just Bernie Sanders and AOC and people like that who are willing to talk a little bit about this, but my friend Cornel West has now also joined. You're going to hear that kind of talk from him. I mean, I understand those are small parts of our political life at this point, but there are signs that there are growing numbers of Americans who are willing to think like that, to ask these questions, to talk about it. And that's why program like yours, Rob, and I really mean that as a compliment to you, you putting these things out there is a very important social service for the United States. Even if people get upset or pissed off at you, it doesn't matter. The thoughts are what you're getting out there, and people will think about it. If not today, then next week or next month, maybe when their wife says something to them or their child points something out to them. This kind of talk, facing these issues, airing perspectives that people don't normally hear, that's the vital thing that can be done now. If it's done well, it'll stimulate and activate people, and we'll see more action in the future.
Professor Richard Wolff, rdwolff.com, democracyatwork.info. As we keep going into this interview, Professor Wolff, we have a couple audience questions, but I do want to get into this since we're still talking about money matters in this country, about digital currency. We've heard a lot of bad things about that. At least I personally heard a lot of bad things about taking freedom away. We saw what the truck is, regardless of what you think about the vaccine, what happened in Canada, where they were shutting down GoFundMes to give to these people, which, you know, 95% of these people are already vaccinated. It's not talked about on the news. And I know you spoke about this, I believe, early on in the year on Jimmy Dore's program about this. But can you talk about digital currency? You for or against it? And what are the issues with this that could hurt Americans?
Here's the problem. Digital currency is a fine idea. There's nothing wrong with it. And I understand that one of the motives is to free up the monetary system from the rigid control operated by the world's big banks and the central banks like the Federal Reserve. They control the money, they monitor every transaction, and the idea of digital currency was to get out from under the control of the big banks and of the Federal Reserve. And the reason that digital currency is being crushed now is because those folks don't want a competitor. They don't want to open up to the cryptocurrency to be an alternative for people. However, their argument also has a basis in truth. That's why they're able to do it. If you have an uncontrolled currency system, then every criminal in the country will use it. Every shady corporation will use it. And so what you get is kind of a wild west of the money system. And when you get that, I have to remind everyone, capitalism is a system that runs on money. When your Uncle Harry at last Thanksgiving made the comment over dinner that money rules the world or money makes the world go round, he understood something correctly. And long ago, when capitalism was young, both in the United States and in the world, we did have a free money system. Banks created money, the government didn't. But it lent itself to such corruption and such criminality and such screw-ups when suddenly you would have a wallet full of money, and because some bank made a decision, the money in your wallet was worthless and you were completely ruined. The people wanted the system to be in some way controlled. And that's where the Federal Reserve and the central banks came in. You can't just undo that, go back to an open system of money without changing the society, because otherwise the same corruption, the same abuse enters in. By the way, I'm not just talking about, drug companies or drug dealers. I'm talking about big corporations that can and will use the crypto system for their own profit making. In other words, you can't fix a part of the system if the system as a whole no longer works.
I guess what I was trying to get to, Professor Wolff, is they're trying to push the government, the central bank digital currency. I do understand what you're saying with the crypto. I think that still needs to be worked out as far as the kinks, as you just stated. But the central bank digital currency, if they push that forward, they could say, hey, we don't like what you said online today. And, this country is there's less and less freedoms, every day in this country. We don't like that you didn't get a vaccine. We don't like that you didn't shop at this store, or you said this racist thing online, or whatever it may be, and they could shut down your bank account. This is what was happening in Canada during those trucker protests. This concerns me that we're getting a lot of government overreach now in this country. And that really scares me, even as a person that's a progressive, that's a person that's for Medicare for all. I'm getting very skeptical about these, having the government have these controls now, because say, all right, we'll give you, jobs guarantee. We'll give you universal basic income. We'll give you Medicare for all, but you got to take this shot. If you want the jobs guarantee, you got to do this and this. If you want a basic income, you got to do this and this. So we have to monitor this and this. So, in the past 3 years, we've learned a lot about who's controlling the country and who's controlling the government. And that's why a person like me that's voted for Bernie Sanders twice, that considers themselves a progressive, I'm very nervous about what's going on with this country. And they could implement these programs, which would be good for our society, but there could be all these control mechanisms. And I apologize for going long on that.
No, I agree with you virtually 100%. I'm a progressive person too.
Right.
I'm very worried, but here's the way I understand it. Anything that happens in this country is going to be a disappointment to progressives as long as you allow a tiny percent of the people to own and operate the wealth producing enterprises of our economy. That's why I'm an economist. I wanted to study what I understood, even as a young person, was the core of the story. So let me explain. I'm going to use as an example the inflation that everybody's been complaining about for the last 2 years. And I'll show you why I mean what I say. Okay. An inflation is a general increase in prices. That's all it is. So if you want to understand why an inflation occurs, the logical next step is to say, who sets the prices? Because if prices are going up, an inflation, and you don't like it, the first question is, well, who's doing that? All right, let me answer the question. Prices are set by employers. If you're an employee, no one has ever asked you to take the morning off to help set prices of what you help to produce. You're not given that opportunity. You are excluded. The people who set prices are the people who run, own, and operate enterprises. The company that makes General Motors, the board of directors decides what the prices of the Chevrolet are that you buy. All right? Starbucks decides what the price of the coffee that you get in the morning is. Okay, how many Americans are owners and operators of enterprise? I'll give you the estimate, 1 to 3%. I'm going to take 3%. Let's assume 3% of our people are actually owners and operators of enterprises, large, medium, and small. Okay, they're the ones who set the prices. If there's an inflation, it means that 3% has raised the price. The rest of us, the 97%, we pay the prices they charge. That's not democracy, man. That is autocracy. That's a tiny minority imposing an inflation on us. Second step, those employers are also the ones who set the wages they pay the rest of us. They control the wages we get. They control the prices we pay. And they screw us to make the most money by pressing the wages down and jacking the prices up. Everybody knows it, but I need to show you that. This is a situation. Those wealthy people at the top who have gotten billionaire status because they can press wages down and jack prices up, they know that they're a tiny minority of very wealthy and powerful people. They are afraid that the mass of the rest of us will use universal suffrage, our right to vote, to undo the inequality of our economy. So they have to control our politics. So they buy the parties, they buy the candidates, they hire the lobbyists, they control the media through advertising. That's our problem. You can't be surprised that what the government does that's useful is offset by something that's good for the people at the top. If you don't change the way the economy is organized, we will always be complaining. We will always be disappointed by what the government is doing to us or making us do. So here's the solution. We don't have to have enterprises run by a tiny group of people at the top. Look, 4 centuries ago or 3 centuries ago, we got rid of kings and queens. We didn't want them to be telling the rest. We were not happy being subjects of king this and queen that. We got rid of them. Well, why are we allowing the CEO of Tesla to be the richest man in the world, throwing his money around, buying politicians, buying Twitter to control the social? What do we do? What? It takes hundreds of thousands of people to make Tesla cars. Elon Musk doesn't make Tesla cars, but he controls it. If we don't change that, we're not serious about wanting to have a different society than the one that keeps squeezing us.
Again, for people listening, Professor Richard Wolff, rdwolff.com. The book is Sickness is the System When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself. Again, economic update on YouTube, and it's democracyatwork.info. As we keep going into the interview, Professor Wolff, we had a couple audience questions I want to get to fast. We talk about corporate capture. And I want to ask you this. I know Cornel West is running now as a Green Party candidate. He's a person that I would vote for. I'm not telling people who to vote for that are listening. I also do like Robert Kennedy Jr. I know you talked about corporate capture. I know he's actually talking about also, besides Cornel West, against that. Do you feel like those two guys are the only people that are worthwhile to vote for in this election cycle? Is Cornel West and Robert F. Kennedy?
Well, I think what you're getting from them is kind of the tip of the iceberg. They are the people willing to put themselves forward, willing to say what other politicians are afraid to say. There are other politicians who agree with them. I know some of them personally, so I can tell you that that's the case. But they figure it's too dangerous. You can't say the kinds of things that Kennedy says or that Cornel West says, because the media will, crucify you. The rich people will give your opponents the money rather than you, and so you'll be dead in the water politically. Look, that's how systems work. If you have a top-down system, if you allow a tiny percentage of your people to be rich and powerful at the top of your society, then you're going to get them trying to stay there and trying to squash or silence or push away anybody who's critical, anybody who offers a different program and a different perspective. But I think that the problems of capitalism in the United States, the lousy jobs, the number of people who live paycheck to paycheck, the cutting back of government supports when we need them most, these are causing more and more people to feel as though the America that they hoped for, the America they were led to expect if they worked hard and went to school and studied, is not there for them. They're going to ask questions. And while you can fob them off for a while by hating on immigrants or trans people or LGBTQ or whatever crazy stuff you're going to do, that stuff goes nowhere. That solves no problems. And when that becomes clearer to people, they'll begin listening to the Bernies and the AOCs and the Cornells, who are beginning to say, look, you got to make some basic changes in this society. And look, these kinds of changes have been made before. During times of slavery, everybody thought that some people are masters, and some people are slaves, and that's the way it's always been, and that's the way it'll always be. Well, it isn't. We got rid of that. And in feudalism, it was lords and serfs. And in capitalism, it's employers and employees. But I got news for you. None of those other systems survived. Capitalism won't either. And one of the things that could, and in my judgment, should replace capitalism is what I call worker co-ops. Yeah. Ways of organizing an enterprise in which one person gets one vote. The idea of democracy, which I like, which we do in our communities where we live, but we don't do in the communities where we work. And why not? I tell you something, if people together voted, they wouldn't give one guy $50 billion and the next guy couldn't send his kid to school to go to college. They wouldn't give one person 12 mansions and the other young lady can't afford an apartment that she needs. I mean, these are things a community of democratic people wouldn't do. We wouldn't do this kind of thing. We wouldn't allow it. And I think we would have a much better society and a much better chance to have a government that serves us rather than using us to maintain inequality.
I want to be gracious with your time with these last two questions. I've been hearing this question since COVID started. We're seeing a lot of people that are not working and they're looking for work. And then you go see all these companies that have help wanted signs up still there. I've talked to these people. They've applied for 20, 30, 40 jobs. They cannot get a job. And these are jobs that are kind of under their education level. They got master's degrees. They can't get a job at a fast food restaurant. What is going on there? Is this like an employer issue that they're just kind of putting that out for kicks? I don't understand it.
Well, we live in a capitalist system. There's no planning. The private enterprises are afraid of having the government come in and in any way control them. They like the government to control us, but not them. Okay. In order to solve the problem of unemployment, You have to have adequate job opportunities and a way, here we go now, of linking, connecting the people that are looking for work with the jobs that need to be done. Now, we don't do that in this country. We don't have a well-oiled system, agency that puts these two things together. And one of the things that agency would have to have is if there's a mismatch, if the jobs that people want are not available, and if the employees that companies want, they can't find, that's why you need to put these things together. And if there is a mismatch, that's no excuse for unemployment. There are millions of things that need to be done in this society. We don't have adequate programs for daycare. We don't have adequate programs for the elderly. What if a government had any brains, it would provide jobs to the 15, and that's what we have, 15 million Americans who are not now working but want a job. You know, in the 1930s, our president went on the radio, Roosevelt, and he said, if the private sector either cannot or will not hire the millions of Americans who need jobs, then I, as the president, will do so. And he created and filled 15 million jobs. Okay, it was done in the 1930s. We know we can do it. There's no excuse. The only reason we don't do that is the private companies are afraid that if your government sets up businesses, sets up labor projects, it'll be a competition with them. That shouldn't hold us back. They suffer competition is less of a burden on us than taking 15 million people and giving them the wages they need, the self-esteem they need. They're holding their head up in the community. They're not a burden. They're working. They're doing useful things. That's what a rational, humane society would do.
As we end the interview here with this last question, can you give the audience a little bit of hope as we end the interview? It seems like it's doom and gloom from what we spoke to today, and that there's no real hope. We don't see a lot of politicians really stepping up to the plate and telling the truth, very few. And also, obviously, the economic crisis in our country is getting worse and worse every day.
Well, I have hope, a lot of hope. And let me tell you why. We're seeing more working people in America taking their own destiny into their hands than we have seen in many, many years. Workers at Starbucks, workers at Apple, workers at Amazon, forming unions, going on strike. In a few weeks, 350,000 UPS truck drivers are going, they just voted, they'll go on strike to get better wages. And so I'm seeing a level of militancy and activation of American workers that I haven't seen in decades. That's a very solid basis for hope. And I am seeing new kinds of politicians like Cory Bush, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. They are coming up, young people, and saying, we want a real change. I don't agree with everything they say or do, but I don't agree with everything that any politician does. But I think these are straws in the wind. I think people are figuring out that we're in a serious crisis, and they're also figuring out that hating on immigrants isn't going to change anything, and fighting over what textbook a school teacher can use or what bathroom a trans person can go into is a way of wasting your time when you could and should be working on what needs to be changed to make your life and your kids' life better.
Again, Professor Richard Wolff, it's rdwolff.com. The book is Sickness is the System: When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself. Economic update on YouTube. Again, democracyatwork.info. Professor Wolff, thanks so much for spending time with us today, and I look forward to another one of these interviews down the road.
Very good. So do I, Rob, and just get in touch. I'll be glad to do it.